25 cents bought you entry. For a quarter, you could walk past the midway games, past the food vendors, past the exhibition halls of industrial machinery and agricultural equipment, and into a building at the edge of the fairgrounds where premature infants, real, living premature infants, lay in glass-fronted metal boxes connected to heating coils and filtered air tubes, tended by nurses in white uniforms, while the crowd pressed against the rail and watched. This was not a sideshow in the degraded sense of the word. The building was clean, the nurses were trained, the physician in charge was, in most documented cases, a legitimate medical professional with genuine expertise in the care of traumatic infants. The equipment worked. Babies who would have died in the hospitals of the period, institutions that had no incubator technology and no established protocol for premature care, survived because of what happened inside those buildings. The incubator shows ran at every major American World's Fair between 1901 and 1940. They ran at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, at the Jamestown Exposition in 1907, at Coney Island, continuously, for nearly 4 decades. The physician most associated with the American Incubator show was Martin Couney, a figure whose credentials were disputed, whose biography contained significant gaps, and whose operations saved, by his own documented count, somewhere between 6,500 and 7,000 infant lives over the course of his career. The hospitals of the period did not want the incubators. Not because the technology was unproven. By the time Cooney arrived in America, incubator technology had been documented in European medical literature for over a decade. The equipment was not experimental. The resistance was institutional, a medical establishment that had not yet decided that premature infants were worth the resource investment required to save them. That is the sentence the record keeps returning to. And it is the sentence that makes everything else about this story strange. Here is what the incubator show actually looked like from the inside. Martin Couney's operation, the version that ran at Coney Island from 1903 to 1943, was not a temporary exhibition. It was a permanent facility, staffed year-round, operating as a functioning neonatal unit financed entirely by admission revenue. Couney employed trained nurses, maintained sterile protocols that were, by the documented assessments of contemporary physicians who visited the facility, comparable to or better than those of the hospital wards of the period. He did not charge the families of the infants. The quarter at the door paid for everything. The infants came from hospitals that could not treat them, and from families that had been told directly that their premature child had no viable medical future. Couney's staff would transport the infant to the Coney Island facility, place it in an incubator, and begin the process of regulated temperature, filtered air, and wet nurse feeding that the medical literature had established as the treatment protocol for premature birth. Some infants arrived weighing under 2 pounds. The survival rate that Cooney documented, and that contemporary medical observers verified in published accounts, was significantly higher than the survival rate for premature infants in the hospital system. The hospitals knew this. The record shows they knew this. Physicians who visited the Coney Island facility published observations in medical journals noting the quality of care. The American Medical Association was aware of Cooney's operation. The academic medical establishment had access to the same European literature on incubator technology that Couney was applying. And yet, the technology did not move from the fairground to the hospital ward in any systematic way until the 1940s, 4 decades after Cooney had demonstrated publicly that it worked. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of a medical technology being available, demonstrated, and documented, and being withheld from the institutional system that could deploy it at scale, is not a condition unique to premature infant care in 1903. It is the operational description of how medical innovation has repeatedly moved or failed to move through institutional systems that have competing priorities beyond patient survival. The incubator was not withheld because it did not work. The archive is unambiguous on that point. It was withheld because the institutional systems of American medicine in the early 20th century had not yet assigned sufficient value to the survival of premature infants to justify the infrastructure investment. Cooney's operation raises a question the record does not fully answer, and the question is not about the showmanship. The families who brought their infants to Coney Island signed consent documents. The record is clear that consent was obtained. What the record is quieter about is the nature of the information those families received, specifically what they were told about outcomes when treatment was not successful. The survival rate Cooney documented was high. It was not universal. Premature infants died at Coney Island. Infants who arrived too early, too small, too compromised by the circumstances of their birth did not survive the incubator period. This is not a criticism of the operation. The same infants would have died in any facility of the period with near certainty. But the record of what happened to those infants, the documentation of deaths, the notification of families, the disposition of remains, is thinner than the record of successful outcomes. If a family member was among the infants treated at Couney's Coney Island facility or at a World's Fair incubator show, these records exist in fragmentary form. The Couney archive is held at the archives of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Send this to anyone who has tried to find that record and hit a wall. The consent documents that do survive in the Couney archive are intake forms, recording the infant's weight, the circumstances of birth, the referring physician or hospital. They are not outcome documents. They record admission. What happened after admission in cases where the outcome was not survival is documented, where it is documented at all, in records that historians note are significantly less complete than the admission records. The show kept detailed records of the babies it saved. The record of the babies it did not save is not equivalently detailed. Martin Cooney's biography is where the record becomes deliberately difficult to follow. The name itself is a starting point. The historical record contains multiple spellings, Couney, Coney, Koenig, across different documents from different periods of his life. His claimed birthplace varies across sources, his medical credentials, the degree he claimed, the European training he referenced, the professional associations he cited, have not been fully verified by historians who have examined the record directly. The most thorough biographical research on Couney, published in the 21st century, concludes that significant portions of his professional biography are not corroborated by the documentary record. This does not mean the incubators did not work. They did. The survival rates are documented by sources independent of Cooney himself. The medical observers who visited the Coney Island facility and published their assessments in peer-reviewed journals were not reporting on a fraud. But what it means is that the man who saved somewhere between 6,500 and 7,000 premature infants over 4 decades may not have been who he said he was. And the archive cannot resolve this. The European record, the documentation that would either confirm or refute Couney's claimed training and credentials, is incomplete in ways that historians note are not entirely explained by the ordinary losses of archival time. Some of the institutions Couney claimed affiliation with have no record of him. Some of the records that would have documented his European practice are not accessible. The gap between what Couney said about himself and what the documentary record confirms is specific enough to notice and wide enough to matter. But here is where the record gets strange in a different way. The medical establishment that questioned Couney's credentials did not question his outcomes. The American Medical Association, which was deeply skeptical of Couney personally, acknowledged in internal correspondence that the survival rates at his facility were genuine. The criticism was not that the babies were not being saved. The criticism was that a showman, a figure operating on a fairground, charging admission, who could not produce verifiable academic credentials, was doing something that hospitals were supposed to do. The establishment's objection was not medical. It was institutional. A man whose credentials could not be verified was saving lives that the credentialed system had decided were not worth saving. The 1939 World's Fair in New York is where the two tracks of this story converge. Couney operated an incubator exhibit at the 1939 fair, one of his last major public exhibitions. That same year, a formal neonatal unit opened at a major American hospital using technology and protocols that were not significantly different from what Couney had been using for 36 years. The hospital unit was celebrated as a medical breakthrough. The medical journals that covered its opening did not prominently reference Couney's 4 decades of documented prior practice. Historians note this omission. It is not subtle. The man who had demonstrated the technology at the scale of hundreds of thousands of fairground visitors, who had maintained survival rates that the hospital system could not match for the first 4 decades of the 20th century, was not integrated into the official history of neonatal medicine as it was being written in real time. The Coney Island facility closed in 1943. Couney died in 1950. The medical record that emerged in the following decades described the development of neonatal intensive care as an achievement of academic medicine. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next investigation follows a different kind of institutional erasure. One where the record survived, but the name attached to it did not. What the Incubator show record reveals, when the admission documents and the medical journal observations and the biographical gaps are assembled together, is a story with 2 uncomfortable conclusions that the official history has not held simultaneously. The first, a man of uncertain credentials saved thousands of infants that the credentialed medical system had written off, and did it for 4 decades publicly at 25 cents a head, while the institutions that should have been doing it were not. The second, the record of what happened to the infants who did not survive, the documentation of those deaths, the notification of those families, the administrative accounting of those outcomes, is not as complete as the record of the infants who lived. Both of those things are in the archive. The show remembered what it wanted to remember. The neonatal intensive care unit is now standard infrastructure in every major American hospital. The technology that Martin Couney demonstrated at Coney Island, regulated temperature, filtered air, specialized feeding protocols for infants born before their systems were ready for the world, is the technological foundation of every NICU operating today. The survival rates for premature infants born in the 21st century are, by any historical comparison, extraordinary. A child born at 28 weeks who would have had no viable medical future in 1903 now has, in a well-resourced hospital, a survival rate that would have been unimaginable to the physicians who told Couney's families to go home and grieve. The official history of how that technology reached the hospital is not complete. Cooney is not absent from the academic literature on neonatal medicine. He appears in footnotes, in historical surveys, in the occasional dedicated study. But the narrative of neonatal medicine as a field describes its development primarily through the contributions of credentialed academic physicians working within institutional frameworks. The 4 decades during which the technology existed, worked, and was not adopted by those institutions. The 4 decades during which families with premature infants had to bring their children to a fairground to access care that hospitals would not provide. That period is not the center of the story that medicine tells about itself. What the Incubator show record asks, and what the archive does not fully answer, is a question that applies beyond neonatal medicine. When an institution decides that a category of patient is not worth the resource investment required to treat them, and when that decision is reversed only after an outsider demonstrates, publicly and at scale, that treatment is both possible and effective. What is the correct name for the 4 decades in between? The archive does not supply that name. It supplies only the admission records and the gap where the outcome records should be. 25 cents bought you entry. For the infants inside, someone had already decided what their lives were worth.